one of the most challenging that all journalists have to deal with, and that is migration. And it's an aspect of the migration story which is the most troubling, and in terms of human rights is one of the most heartrending and indeed poignant issues that we journalists have to discover, and we have to tell the truth about. So the human trafficking aspect of the story of migration gets to the very heart of the problem of human exploitation that takes place by unscrupulous groups who use migrants for commercial exploitation. And it's a very tricky story for journalists to deal with. Now, I've been working with international organizations that are trying to help journalists to cover this story. And it's really important that journalists understand the best way to go about it. They need to get good information. They need to make sure that migrants and the people who are the victims of the worst aspects of migration, such as human trafficking, are able to tell their story and to be heard. It's very easy to say that, but actually how do we do it in practice? I'm going to sort of talk about a few things which I hope that you'll be able to maybe raise some questions about and really challenge some of the things that I'm saying, because there isn't an absolutely clear template for things that must be done. What there are guidelines that help journalists who want to do the right thing to be able to work effectively. Now, one of the first things we have to understand about migration, and also about the human trafficking aspect of migration, is that, you know, we're talking about serious numbers. It's estimated by the International Organization of Labour, the ILO, that there are up to 40 million people around the world who are living in some condition of or some form of modern slavery. And modern slavery is a strange term, but because there are many of us, because as journalists we would like to sort of address it directly, slavery is when people have no freedom to live their lives without actually seeking the permission of others. And modern or not, it's slavery for millions and millions of people. There are around 150 million children who are subject to forms of child labor, which break every human right you can imagine. So we have to, as journalists, work out, right, how do we tell this story? How do we deal with it? I'm glad that Hussein has joined us, and if you've got some questions, let us know. Let me sort of go to the very first part of the challenge. And I think the first part of the challenge is for journalists to just get their facts right before they even start on the story. And what I mean by that is that we as journalists, if we're going to report any story, we have to know what we're talking about. So we have to get the terms right. And very often you find that journalists get confused because they don't know the legal position. What is the definition of an economic migrant? What is the legal term that, what does it mean to be a refugee? What does it mean to be an asylum seeker? And in the area of human trafficking, there's a lot of confusion among journalists about who constitutes a migrant smuggler and what is human trafficking itself. And so therefore, I think we have to begin from a position where we need to understand the terms that we're using. So for the guidelines that we have developed for human trafficking, we have been very, very clear about it. It's very important to understand that someone who's engaged in human trafficking is committing an offense against the human rights of an individual. Human trafficking is about control of someone who is being forced through that system of control to move from one country and another, and very often is passed on from one trafficking agency to another trafficking agency, almost certainly for criminal purposes. Very often that will be to do with work, forms of slave labor. Sometimes that will be to do with sex work. It'll be for the transportation of prostitutes and so on. It will be for young people will be sort of being moved into child labor. So what you have is human trafficking is an organized criminal network of people and organizations controlling the lives of people, where they live, how they live, and so on. And so human trafficking is a very clear set of criminal actions against the rights of individuals. Migrant smuggling is a different matter. Migrant smuggling is actually basically a crime against the state. It's where agencies will help people to cross borders where they don't have documentation to cross those borders. So they might, people might pay a lot of money, and then people will put them on boats and say, well, look, we'll point you in this direction and you'll end up somewhere where people will look after you. Migrant smugglers are very much interested in just creaming as much money as they can out of people who are very often vulnerable and don't have much money, and they give what they have to reach what they hope will be a destination of hope and a new life for them. So smugglers are basically people who are getting around the rules that the state imposes on the right of people to enter into a country. Now, this is an important distinction. So I hope that before we start looking at how we report the issue, that we take some time to understand the issue. Just as when you're reporting migration, you have to know the difference between who is a refugee, who is an asylum seeker, and what are these people, what are the different entitlements and rights of these people under international law. So I think that that's the first thing I wanted to say is, look, let's make sure that we understand the issues that we're talking about. Let's understand the terms that we're using and so on. And so when I'm talking about human trafficking, for example, human trafficking, very often media like to see human trafficking in terms of what you might call the sexy end of the story, which is human trafficking for sexual purposes, commercial sexual exploitation. Women and children, particularly for commercial sexual exploitation. Actually, that's not the biggest story, even though all the evidence shows that media in most countries will focus on the salacious, sexy story. The biggest story actually is the question of migrant labor and slave labor, that human trafficking is mainly about and mainly involves people who are being trafficked from one country to another to do work, all sorts of different work and so on. And so therefore we have to understand that it's not enough just to follow the most sensational story that we can see in this area, but to really look at the background. So use good sources of information to get your background right. So go to the International Labour Organization website, and they've got a wonderful set of material related to human trafficking, child labor, slave labor, and so on. Go to the site of the International Organization of Migration. They too have got wonderful bits and pieces of information useful for journalists. In every country of the world, they will be able to sort of help you and direct you towards information which will be useful. Go to the site for the UN Commissioner, the High Commissioner for Refugees. Again, very often they're working in those areas which are pretty much underreported, very often areas where the countries are suffering from war and extreme poverty or humanitarian crisis. And they again will give you inside information which is absolutely essential to telling this story well. So try to make sure that you've got good sources for the information that you want to deal with. So I would say if you're trying to develop this this story, get your sources right, get the facts right, and understand what you're talking about. And then once we've got that sort of basic framework, then we can move into trying to deal with the story in some sort of concrete ways. So I see Hussein is a managing editor of a political issue magazine at Al Anrain University. Well, you're welcome. What the Thomson Reuters Index is, would be great to hear from you, and exactly what you're interested in these issues. There's tremendous amount of work being done in the Arab world around these issues, as you can imagine. The fallout from the terrible humanitarian crisis that has emerged in the Middle East, and particularly in around Syria and so on, which we see being played out in countries like Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey and so on, is testament to the gravity of the crisis. Now, Hussein's asking me here if we can help your college to be classified as a magazine. Well, we're not in the business of sort of rubber stamping or being able to give labels or kite marks to sort of quality. What we hope is that that if your college is following the standards that the Thomson Foundation and the Ethical Journalism Network are promoting, we certainly will be glad to help where we can and to cooperate with you and your colleagues if that's going to be useful. So let us know. I mean, if you want to follow up with that can be fine. Look, I'm here talking with, on behalf of the Ethical Journalism Network on the Thomson Foundation Journalism Now platform, where we are trying to develop a sort of a discussion about how do we deal with the challenge of reporting trafficking, human trafficking, in the context of the wider migration story. And then that wider story raises a whole number of tricky ethical questions for journalists, like, for example, how we carry out our interviews. One of the most important issues in dealing with human trafficking, as it is in dealing with migration, is to give voice to the victims. We have to make sure that we're not only using people who speak for the victims. We want to, if we can, hear the story from out of their own mouths. It's a really important aspect of journalism. It helps journalism get closer to the story, but it also helps to sort of explain in more emotional and critical detail the experience of those who have been affected by it. But that's not easy. So we have to make sure when we're doing our interviews and when we're reporting this story that we do it sensitively. That's one of the reasons why in the guidelines that we have produced for reporting human trafficking, we have suggested that media organizations should have targeted discussions internally in order to develop internal editorial strategies for covering this sort of story, so that everybody in the newsroom is aware of the need for care and sensitivity in the way that the story is dealt with. One of the things that I think is very important is that journalists and media organizations should establish good links with the sources that they're going to depend upon in telling the story effectively. And that particularly means dealing with NGOs and particular groups within the community that are protecting and defending the interests of migrants, that are helping people who are caught, as so many people are, as we know, between smugglers and traffickers, and an ambition they have to move from one country to another country to make a new life for themselves. So we have to be make sure that we are dealing with those groups in civil society that are trying to protect the human rights of those migrants and those people who are the victims of trafficking, the survivors of trafficking. We have to make sure that we are liaising with them to make sure that they help us get the story told. Very often, these NGOs will be very suspicious of journalists. They'll be suspicious of journalists because they'll be worried that journalists will be just about trying to get the most sensational story they can, that journalists will exploit the individuals who've suffered enough before they arrive in the hands of or under the shelter and sanctuary of human rights groups and so on. So we have to be very, very careful in making sure that we do not blunder into areas without first checking who are the reasonable groups in civil society or the NGOs that are dealing with these groups, who we can rely on for good information and so on. Sometimes journalists have to do it themselves. Sometimes journalists might find themselves that there isn't a decent NGO covering the story. There isn't a decent spokesperson for the government that's going to give them information. Journalists are going to have to think on their feet. They're going to have to work on this issue themselves. So how do they do that? One of the things that they have to do is they have to recognize they have to take responsibility for it. So as a journalist, you might have to interview young people, children, who've been the victims of trafficking and so on. It's very important to follow the rules regarding interviewing young people and children. The need for care and sensitivity is important. The first thing to remember is that anyone who has been a victim of trafficking or forced migration, who's involved in forced labor, been subject to the corruption of modern slavery, whatever, is a person who's almost certainly been traumatized. And if you're dealing with a traumatized person, a journalist has to show an extreme degree of care and sensitivity. So you have to not ask people to relive the tragedy and the ordeal that they've been through in such a way that you, in fact, just create a fresh nightmare for them. It's very important to ask questions which are sensitive, which help people to talk freely, but without feeling any sense of pressure, and certainly without them feeling that they are undergoing or reliving sometimes what has been a very harrowing ordeal altogether. So the need for that sensitivity is particularly important in dealing with children and young people. Some people might be flattered to have a journalist or with a camera or someone talking to them and so on, but they have to be protected against themselves. So journalists have to always recognize that they could be part of a process of putting people at risk. So how do we avoid that? The way we do that is to make sure that we create a proper environment for the interviews that we want to carry out. So the environment should be subdued. We shouldn't be forcing people to fit into photographs that are just going to sort of fit with our image of the drama that we want to try to recreate. Our priority should be about making people feel comfortable and allowing them to be able to speak freely without putting themselves at risk. So our interviewing techniques here call for a great deal of care and attention. So another issue which we really have to take account of is the question of pictures and images. What sort of pictures and images do we use? Inevitably, journalists are interested in images and ideas and video and film that will capture the drama that's involved, but they mustn't do that at the expense of the people that they're dealing with. So that means we have to be very, very careful. And we've got some examples of how salacious material has been used, film and photography, for example, about women who have been the victims of commercial sexual exploitation, who have been trafficked into prostitution. And we see that all that the media do in that case is basically carry on the process of objectifying women and the victims. And it does not do anything to allow the story to be told in such a way that allows the individual to be able to express themselves freely. So I think we have to be very, very careful about the images that we use. Of course, it goes without saying that we shouldn't be using explicit images of violence, and we should, we should not be identifying people whose anonymity we should respect. Now, anonymity is a big, an important question, ethical question for journalists. And so on. Now I'm asked here, and I'm very grateful to Gloria, who's asking a question, should we have some kind of psychotherapy training to enable journalists how to interview without aggravating further trauma. I'm not quite sure if we need formal training, Gloria, but I think what we do need is we do need to talk to people before we interview particular individuals about what is the experience that we've been through. Can we find responsible adults in the case of young people who we might be talking to, or can we find people who have given them assistance, who can give us background which will help us to identify the dangerous areas that our interviewing might take. So I agree very much with you. I think good journalism is about making people feel at ease. It's also very important to give them the confidence that they can talk freely without added suffering. So therapy training is good if you've had it. It's not absolutely essential, but it's part of that process, I think, what I was talking about earlier, where newsrooms need to make sure that their people, their reporters, their camera people understand what they're getting themselves into. Actually, sometimes journalists themselves can be affected by the trauma of interviewing people who have suffered terrible experiences. Children and vulnerable people, particularly sort of women who've very often been the victims of violence as they've been trafficked and so on, are incredibly vulnerable. So we have to make sure that we ourselves are ready for dealing with this, and that we are able to give them the support that they need, as well as being able to get the story out of them. So I think that a lot of what you're asking for there has to be found in the amount of preparation that we give ourselves before we start dealing with this story. The presence of other people, Martina's asking about whether or not we should have, when we're interviewing young people or we're interviewing others, should we have someone present, a social worker or a psychologist, during the interview? Look, I think the question there is, it's as a good journalist, you must make a judgment there. The judgment has got to be based on what is good for the individual that you're interviewing. You're interviewing a child. I think it's responsible to have a responsible adult present. If you're interviewing someone under the age of 18 or 16, I think that's clear. If it makes the interviewee feel more at ease and comfortable, absolutely. There's nothing wrong at all with having a social worker or a psychologist during the interview, or anyone else present during the interview that the person will feel good about. And I think a good journalist is going to have to evaluate the situation. Now, sometimes there will be tricky situations. Sometimes a journalist will say, well, look, this person is not in a safe environment. They're still under the custody of people, maybe, who are not giving them the support that they need. And so the presence of another person may be there. It will be really very, very useful to recognize that the controlling elements that very often happens to people who are vulnerable when they move into a new situation needs to be recognized. So I think these are good questions. I think what they do is they tell us that a journalist has got to show such a degree of care and sensitivity that they're constantly aware of the environment, who's around, and what is particularly or potentially threatening for the survivor or the victim that we're talking to. It's our role to get a story, that's clear, but it's got to be also our role to make sure we don't get stories at the expense of other people by making their lives worse or creating more harm. So these are good points, and I think that you will find more information about these particular aspects of migration reporting and the guidelines that we have produced on media and trafficking. These guidelines are actually extremely useful. They're very helpful. They deal with everything that I've been talking about. And I think they're really necessary for journalists to be able to tell this story effectively and clearly. So all of this is very useful. Now, there's one thing I really wanted to tell you about is when finding this story. I mean, here's a question for those of you who are interested: is how do you find the human trafficking story in your own backyard? For example, human trafficking isn't just about the people who get off the boats in Greece or in southern Italy and so on, or the people who are bundled out of lorries and vehicles once they cross the border somewhere else. Very often, the victims of human trafficking are around the corner from where you live. One of the things that we don't realize today is that many of us are complicit in creating and maintaining the economies that allows human trafficking to be viable in the modern world. What I mean about that is, if you get your car washed for a few dollars or a few euro or a few pound, the question you might ask yourself is, how on earth does anyone make a living out of that? Very often you'll find in some of the most developed economies, low-grade, labor-intensive industries, such as nail parlors in your high street, car washes, places, building sites where work is being done, places where there are lots of people doing cheap work. There's a question there. Why are there so many people doing this cheap work? Where do they come from? How are they able to scratch a living from this and so on? Evidence that's been picked up in the United Kingdom, for example, has actually found that very often you see the evidence of human trafficking on your doorstep. And so we as journalists need to think, where are people who have been the victims of human trafficking? Where are they likely to be working? Are they likely to be working on building sites where cheap labor is very often easily found? Are they working in sweatshops producing textiles and so on? Are they working in, as I say, services like car washes or nail bars or other little areas of activity which are under the radar of the formal economy, but are absolutely vital to provide the economic basis for which human trafficking takes place? So look around. Have a look where there might be stories where this is possible. I see there are some questions being raised now, which I think are really very important about this story, about bribery to sources involved with migration or trafficking from Zira, so that they can have an exclusive report. Well, you know, we journalists have to understand that if we want to do work that's good work, we mustn't get involved in the business of corruption ourselves. Bribing sources involved with migration or trafficking so they can have an exclusive report is actually not, to me, a very good practice. And very often, sometimes, if you're paying money for stories, one of the big problems about it is that people will embellish their stories. They'll tell you a bit more than the truth. They may even, in order to maybe raise the price of the value of their work, if they know that they're being paid for it, they might exaggerate. They might actually undermine very much the quality of what's being told. Now, are there conditions in which we should pay people for information or pay people for talking to us? Well, actually, sometimes there are. Sometimes we have to make sure that as a result of talking to us, people will not suffer more. Some people, if they talk to us and then they're going to be the subject of our stories, and they might be on the TV or they might be in the press or they might be part of an online report, may find that they are going to suffer as a result of that. So what do we do in those cases? I think we have to examine each case on its merit. It may be necessary to give some assistance to people in order that they don't suffer as a result of talking to us and giving information to us and so on. Sometimes it's for their own protection. We may have to, it may be useful to give them a bit of money so that they got somewhere secure to sleep or to eat food and so on. And I think that sort of humanitarian assistance is absolutely clear. What we mustn't do is get involved in a process where we are systematically paying out heaps of money in order to buy information, in order to beat the competition, because that creates a sort of an unhealthy market for journalism, which inevitably leads to bad journalism and so on. So we have to judge every case on its merits, and it's very difficult, but you know, that's the approach that we have to take. So you get lots more information about these sorts of issues on the Ethical Journalism Network website, and you'll find, of course, much more information about these sorts of questions, which are absolutely critical, on the Thompson Foundation Journalism Now courses. These live courses are open to everybody. Some of them are free. The ethics one is free, so please take it. It will be really a good opportunity for you to find out a bit more about what I've been talking about. So we've raised an awful lot of issues here. I would hope that one of the most important things that when we're doing this story is to remember, as I was saying earlier, that in order to understand the trafficking or the smuggling angle of the story, we have to find out where the money is coming from. We have to follow the money as the case goes, as good investigative journalists will tell you. Who benefits, who pays, find out how much money is being paid in order for people to arrive at where they are. Go back and see who is benefiting from it, and so on. The final thing I think, which is really important about this, is to recognize that the end result of human trafficking, it should not automatically mean that people are deported. People have to be cared for. And we have to look at human trafficking as part of that general question of migration. People wanting to move to new countries, to new places of work, to try to improve their lives. There are valid concerns about migration. There are valid concerns about criminality and human trafficking and smuggling, and how that destabilizes society. But we in journalism should not be posing our stories in a narrative framework which is placing blame, responsibility, and a negative interpretation on the victims themselves. That is, the people who are the migrants or the people who are the victims of human trafficking. It's our role to tell their story, but it's also our role to question the authorities and how they're dealing with these issues, and to point to solutions, to look for ways in which these problems can be resolved, how the aspirations of people to start a new life can be resolved, how the need for society to identify, prosecute, and if necessary, put in jail traffickers and smugglers that are breaking the law. That's clearly a priority for us as well. So there's a lot of important follow-up work that needs to be given. So when we start out on the migration or the human trafficking story, we should recognize that it's not just one story. It's part of a whole narrative about modern societies, societies that are losing people who are leaving, societies that are embracing people who are coming. And we in journalism have to tell that story without creating more division, more hostility, and really focusing on one of the primary ethics of journalism and what we've been talking about today, which is humanity. That actually it's the role of journalists to tell stories, but also to find ways of trying to relieve the suffering of others and to find solutions to intractable problems. So there we are. Thank you very much for being with us. You will find more now on the Journalism Now platform of the Thompson Foundation. The live courses are there. Please go to them. Have a look at what you will be thinking of. They're not as tough as they look, and actually they are really, really encouraging. They will, you will always benefit from taking part in them. And go to the Ethical Journalism Network site, where we are continuing to work on these sorts of issues and other issues like combating hate speech, trying to confront corruption inside journalism, looking at how we can improve media and good governance, ownership and transparency in a very difficult information environment. So good luck to you, and thank you very much for being with us.